I'm going to talk today about a topic that I described as movements and companies. And it created a fair amount of confusion among people who read the description of this session. A number of people came up to me and said, well, wait a minute, are you talking about movements against companies? Or are you talking about movements or companies? The notion of movements and companies together is a bit foreign to many people, but I want to make the case that actually increasingly, as a result of changes that are going on in our business environment, the most successful companies will become movements over time. And to make that case, I want to start just briefly with painting a broader context of some of the work we've been doing around what we call the big shift, the global transformation of business and society that's being driven in large part by digital technology infrastructures. Now, I come from Silicon Valley, and I've been there for 35 years, and I'll tell you there's a standard Silicon Valley script. You start with a demo of a really neat new technology, and then you spend the rest of the talk exploring all the incredible opportunities created by that technology. I want to start my talk by exploring the dark side of all of this technology. And it's a dark side that's actually intrinsic to the technology. We can't have the technology without this dark side. And so I think it's important for us to understand what it is. And what I mean by dark side is mounting performance pressure on all of us. As individuals and as institutions, this digital technology is creating mounting performance pressure. It's intensifying competition by systematically and substantially reducing barriers to entry and barriers to movement on a global scale. It's accelerating the pace of change. Studies have been done around product life cycle compression. It used to be if you came up with a really great new product and got it into market, you could ride that wave for a long time. We now have shorter and shorter time before the next product comes into the marketplace. And then as if that weren't bad enough, there's a third form of mounting pressure, which is because of all this connectivity we've created, these tiny events, often some faraway place that we've never heard of, quickly cascade and become extreme events, what Taleb calls the black swan effect, disrupting our best laid plans and predictions, leaving us scrambling at the last minute trying to figure out how we make do in that situation. So mounting pressure on all of us. I think one of the interesting things to understand in a world of mounting pressure is we all, as human beings, have very natural psychological reactions to mounting pressure. Cognitive psychology has studied this, and there are a whole set of reactions that start with a notion of, in a time of mounting pressure, we have a tendency to magnify the perception of risk and discount the perception of reward. We also have a tendency to shorten our time horizons. Pressure is so intense right now, I can't afford to think about the long term. I just got to focus on what I'm doing today to survive. And as we shorten our time horizons, we tend to fall back to what economists call a zero-sum view of the world. It's a win-lose world out there. There's a fixed set of resources. If all we're doing is focusing on today, there's a fixed set of resources. And the only question on the table is, am I going to get them, or are you going to get them? Win-lose. And when you fall into that kind of mind frame, trust erodes very quickly. You seem like a nice person, but at the end of the day, only one of us is going to get these resources. Who's it going to be? I can't trust that it's going to be me. So, you get these cognitive biases building up over time. Highly dysfunctional biases, and they play out at an individual level. Each of us as individuals. They play out at an institutional level, and they play out at a political and social level. I would argue that part of the dysfunctional nature of the U.S. political system, and I will reveal my biases in this, is that on both sides of the aisle, we've fallen prey to these cognitive biases. It's all about threat and risk. It's all about short time horizons. It's us versus them. We have to mobilize quickly, or else we're going to be dead. The enemies differ depending on which side of the aisle you're on, But there are enemies out there, and they're attacking us now. So my belief is that kind of cognitive bias implication of mounting pressure is not sustainable. You get into a vicious cycle where the more these cognitive biases play out, the more we tend to isolate ourselves, the more we tend to focus on threats, and it just becomes a self-reinforcing downward cascade. So the question is, what do we do about all this? I think one of the key elements here is the important role of movements in shifting those cognitive biases. I want to explore a little bit what I mean by movements, what are the elements that make for a successful movement, and then why companies ought to become movements. So, let me start with what do I mean by movement? I mean, again, these terms are used pretty loosely. I'm going to focus specifically on movements that are organized efforts to mobilize a large number of participants at a grassroots level to pursue some kind of broad agenda for change. So emphasis on organization. A lot of people talk about movements as movements of ideas, and there's certainly those kinds of movements. I'm talking about movements that involve organizing people to try to change things in a significant way. The paradox, there are lots of paradoxes. You'll find that I love paradox. I run a research center called the Center for the Edge, which in itself is a paradox. How can you be a center for the edge? You're either a center or you're the edge. Come on, pick. One of the paradoxes is that at the exact same time that we have these digital technology infrastructures that make it far more feasible to mobilize mass movements, we actually see mass movements having a harder and harder time forming and surviving and sustaining themselves. I mean, we're all familiar with examples like Occupy Wall Street, anti-corruption movements in many emerging economies, the Arab Spring movement in the Middle East, all of them coming up with a burst of energy and having some initial impact, but then having a hard time sustaining themselves. And so I think one of the questions is, what's required for a successful movement? And I should say as well, just to clarify, I completely understand there are some movements that are movements for evil. Nazism, communism, you name them. There are a lot of movements that have driven evil into the world. I'm focused on movements that I believe have positive impact, that have the ability to help each of us individually and collectively to achieve more of our potential over time. So I want to focus on those kinds of movements and try to understand what are the elements that are required for these kinds of movements to be successful. Throughout my life, I've been involved in a variety of movements, and I've also studied movements from a historical perspective. And I've come to the point of view that there are two elements, ultimately, that are required for a successful movement to generate sustained impact over time. And those two elements are what I call narratives and creation spaces. And so I want to talk a little bit about each of them because I have some rather unique ways of defining those. I've found that over time, most people that I talk to have a tendency to talk about stories and narratives as kind of synonymous. They mean the same thing. We use them interchangeably. I want to suggest that I think there's an important difference that needs to be named and identified, and whether we call it hoopla and hoop-de-doo, whatever, I think there's a distinction here. On the one side, stories, as I define them, have two characteristics. One is they're self-contained. They have a beginning, a middle, and a resolution. Something happens to resolve the story. It comes to an end. And the story is ultimately about the speaker, about the storyteller, or it's about those people over there. It's not about you. You can sit and listen and use your imagination as to what you would have done in the context of that story, but it's not about you. It's about others. In contrast, for me, narratives are quite different on both levels. The first point about a narrative to me is it's open-ended. There has been no resolution in the narrative. There's some kind of opportunity or threat out on the horizon, relatively long distance away, but it's not determined whether we're actually going to achieve that opportunity or address that threat. To be resolved. And the resolution to that narrative hinges on you. It hinges on the choices and actions you're going to take. What's it going to be? You have a role to play in resolving this narrative. So it's a very different way of thinking about a call to action. Now, people talk about the emotional engagement around stories, and for sure, stories are very emotionally engaging. On the other hand, I suggest that if you look throughout history, millions of people have given their lives for a narrative. They have made the ultimate sacrifice. You want to talk about engagement and action? Narratives are very, very powerful and should not be underestimated. So I think narratives have an important role to play. And just a couple of quick examples, we can go into more detail if you want, but for me, an example of a narrative is the American narrative, right? America, the land of opportunity. No matter what your background or circumstances, you have the ability to come here and do incredible things. But it's not predetermined. You got to come here, and you got to do those things. Silicon Valley had a very powerful narrative, still does. And we have a new generation of digital technology out there that has the potential to change the world in profound and really positive ways. But it's only the potential. You have to come and help us do this. It drew people from all over the world to Silicon Valley to participate in that narrative. Very effective in drawing people from all over the world. So, narratives, very powerful. There are different, you can think about narratives in different contexts. So I think all of us have individual narratives. We have lived our lives based on a narrative that's individual to us. Very few of us, I think, have taken the trouble to make it explicit or articulate it. But if you reflect on the choices and actions we've taken throughout our lives, there's a narrative that's driving us and shaping our choices. You can think about institutional narratives, companies and organizations having narratives, and you can think about social, religious, political narratives that have driven major change throughout history. You can also make a distinction between threat-based narratives and opportunity-based narratives. And for the purpose of trying to address the mounting pressure and the cognitive biases that I talked about, I want to really focus on the potential of the opportunity-based narratives. Because I think threat-based narratives actually reinforce all those cognitive biases, and it's one of the reasons I think our political system has fallen back to threat-based narratives on both sides of the aisle. But opportunity-based narratives have really interesting characteristics to them in terms of those cognitive biases. An opportunity-based narrative focuses us on the future and says there's a huge reward out there. And yeah, there are some risks and challenges getting to that reward, but magnify the perception of reward, discount the perception of risk. And by the way, that opportunity is pretty far down the line, so you can't just think about today. You got to keep your eye on the long term. So it expands our time horizons. And because it's long term, and because it's a very big opportunity that we can all participate in, now we move from a zero-sum view of the world to a positive-sum view of the world, where if we come together, we can do amazing things. And there'll be much more value and resource to be shared among us. And so it tends to reinforce trust and collaborative action as a result. So I think opportunity-based narratives play a critical role in terms of the kinds of movements that I'm talking about. But I think narratives alone are not sufficient. There's a second key element that has to come into play, and it's a form of platform. It's what I've called creation spaces. And what do I mean by that? I came to the notion of creation spaces by looking, as I mentioned, we have a view of the world as a big shift with mounting performance pressure. So we said, let's go out and look at environments where there is sustained extreme performance improvement. What can we learn from those environments? Some of the environments we looked at were extreme sports, big wave surfing, and extreme skiing, and all the other sports that are pushing the limits. We also ended up looking at online video games, particularly war games like World of Warcraft. Talk about mounting performance pressure. You're going to die if you don't make the right choice. That's a lot of pressure. And what we found in all of those environments, despite the diversity of the environments, was a common form of organization, which we ended up calling creation spaces. And what's interesting about creation spaces, they have two basic characteristics. The basic unit of organization is a very small group of people, typically 10 to 20 people at most. And they form deep trust-based relationships by engaging in action, shared action, to try to make a difference in their environment. And it's a very powerful way of accessing tacit knowledge, which is a key to learning. But then there is a second element, which is those small groups, those small units, were brought together into a much broader network, mesh network of relationships, where they could reach out beyond their local group and ask questions, get access to ideas and resources from other groups, so they could learn faster by not just focusing on their individual group, but by connecting more broadly. And if you look at environments like big wave surfing, these creation spaces are critical to the sustained extreme performance improvement that we've seen in that arena. So it's a really interesting combination of these two elements that come together to create an environment where we can learn much faster than we could on our own or as part of a large homogeneous entity. One of the big aha moments for me was as I was studying these creation spaces in extreme sports and online war games, I said, you know, this is very familiar. Back in my youth, I was the head of a local chapter of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, in the anti-war movement. And as I reflected, I said, you know, SDS was organized as a creation space. Small groups, units of action at the local level, connected together and learning from each other through a variety of mechanisms of connecting. And then I started to look at other movements and said, wow, every single successful movement that I know about has that kind of creation space attribute to it. Really interesting. Despite incredible diversity and different points in history, creation spaces were key to how you organize these movements. So it's an interesting approach to driving learning and performance improvement, and allows you to take very complex environments that are rapidly changing and focus people on local action with short-term impact and tight feedback loops, so everybody's learning faster and faster as a result of participating. Now you bring these two elements together, these creation spaces and a narrative. Now you've got something really powerful. You've got a narrative that's a call to action around a long-term opportunity that brings everyone together. But then you have these creation spaces where the focus is on local action and learning at the local level in very trust-based small groups. Very interesting combination that reinforces each other into a virtuous cycle. I talked about the vicious cycle of these cognitive biases and mounting pressure. Now we have a virtuous cycle going on, because the faster people learn in these small groups and the more impact they have at the local level, the richer and more credible that long-term narrative becomes. And the richer and more credible that long-term narrative becomes, the more people we can attract into the movement, and the faster everybody's going to learn because there are more small groups participating and learning individually and then collectively. So a very powerful combination that unleashes this virtuous cycle that I believe has the potential to really address the cognitive biases that I've been talking about. So, question is, what does this have to do with companies? Go back to this notion of a big shift and mounting performance pressure. My belief is that one of the most effective ways of responding to that mounting pressure is to be able to achieve far more impact with limited resources. And in that context, I think movements are very powerful for companies. So if we think about, I want to clarify a couple of things because many people, when I talk about movements and companies, they'll say, oh, you're talking about corporate social responsibility initiatives, getting involved in environmental causes or diversity causes. No, those are important. I don't want to minimize them or trivialize them, but they are not central to what the company is and what the company does on a day-to-day basis. And I think the key question is, how do we construct movements that are integral to the purpose and mission of the company, but that require a lot more participants than just the people within the company itself? That's what I mean by a movement at a corporate level. The challenging thing is that there aren't many great examples of companies and movements. I would say there aren't, if you go back to this notion of narratives and creation spaces, there aren't even great examples of companies who have compelling narratives. I joke often that when I talk to executives about the power of narrative, they'll kind of say, oh yeah, we have one of those, we have a narrative. We started in a garage somewhere, we faced incredible obstacles, we achieved amazing things, and there's a lot more to come. It's open-ended. It's not yet resolved. There's still incredible things. My point to these executives is, wait a minute, that narrative is about you. It's not about the people you're trying to speak to outside your company. What's their role? Is their role just to sit back in awe at the incredible things you've done? Is their role just to buy more of your products? Okay, that's not a narrative the way I mean it. It's not a call to action to the people you're addressing. And so I think the question is, what would a corporate narrative look like? I'll give one example of a company that I think does have close to what I mean by a corporate narrative, and it's Apple. Apple, at one level, you can think about it as it's in a tight slogan, think different. But if you unpack that slogan, there's a really interesting narrative behind it. Narrative at a high level goes, for decades we had digital technology that forced us into these uniform boxes and gave us numbers, and our job was to fit into the machine. And now, for the first time, we have a set of technology that allows us to establish our unique individuality and potential. But it's not a given. It's not automatic. For that to happen, you have to think different. Are you willing to think different? Will you think different? That's a pretty interesting narrative. It's not really about Apple. Apple, yeah, we have some products and technology that's relevant to this opportunity, but it's about you. It's about what you can accomplish. And I think it helps to explain why, for many people, Apple has become, in essence, a religion. There's a very powerful narrative that speaks to a lot of people. Let me just suggest that if you take that narrative, what if Apple had taken it to the next level and started to organize and sponsor creation spaces where they would help small groups of people to think different and to figure out how they could act to change their environment, their local environment, by thinking different, and achieve more of their potential by thinking different. Now you would have started to see what I call a movement, narrative plus creation space. So that's an example of narrative in a corporate setting. I would say in terms of creation spaces, again, not a lot of great examples of creation spaces organized by companies, at least that I'm aware of. And again, part of my purpose in speaking with you today is to draw out examples and illustrations that I'm not aware of. But one kind of close thing to a creation space by a company is from Johnson & Johnson, Baby Center, yeah. Really interesting online site that invites parents with small children, babies, to come together and seek advice from each other. You know, raising a small baby is not the easiest thing in the world, and often there's a value in getting help from other people who are in similar situations or from experts that are brought in on a specific topic or issue. But the interesting thing is Baby Center broadly has been basically what I would call a discussion forum. You can come in and post a question and get really helpful answers and incredible value to the participants in that platform. But they haven't gone the other step to say, what if we helped people to come together, the parents of small kids to come together in small local groups to learn from each other in tighter ways around the challenges of raising kids, and then allow those groups to come together, encourage those groups to form and come together and seek broader advice when needed. That would have been a very interesting next step in building towards a creation space. And what if we layered on top of that a really compelling opportunity-based narrative about the fact that we have an opportunity today to raise children that will achieve far more potential than we ever could when we were kids. And what would it take to achieve that potential? Now you would start to see a really interesting movement emerging that combines a narrative and a creation space. So I think interesting possibilities. I mean, just as one other example, even more speculative, in healthcare. I think we're all familiar with the quantified self movement and the increasing focus on Internet of Things and wearable devices to monitor our physical well-being. What if a healthcare company took on the narrative of the opportunity for us to focus on wellness, to achieve longevity, longer longevity, and quality of life by focusing on wellness, and help to catalyze creation spaces where people could come together who saw this as an opportunity and learn from each other in small groups and connect more broadly. That would be a really interesting movement for a healthcare company. So, I think, at least I think a lot of opportunity for companies to focus on how to catalyze and mobilize movements and amplify the impact of those movements by developing narratives, compelling narratives, opportunity-based narratives, and creation spaces that help people to learn faster. I think what this does, if you think about it from a corporate viewpoint, there are a lot of benefits that these kinds of movements could create. And the one thing is leverage. I mean, all companies, even the very largest companies in a world of mounting pressure, have scarce resources. And the ability to augment those resources by mobilizing a whole lot of third parties around a movement creates a form of leverage that's very powerful. Not leverage in the form of adding more debt to the balance sheet, but leverage in terms of mobilizing capability. Movements, the way I've described them, are really powerful environments for distributed innovation. These creation spaces that I've talked about, there's incredible innovation in each of these small groups as they each seek to go out and make a difference in their local area. And they're watching and learning from each other to see what works and what doesn't work. Huge distributed innovation that goes far beyond the four walls of the enterprise that's driving the movement. And the potential, as a result, to accelerate learning becomes very significant. And I would suggest in a world of mounting pressure, we're driven by exponential technologies that are accelerating the pace of change. Learning becomes more and more central to sustained success. In some of the stuff we've written, it's the notion of moving from scalable efficiency as a key rationale for your company to scalable learning. And what does it take to scale learning? Well, one of the key things is a notion of moving beyond the four walls of your enterprise and scaling to engage a much broader group of participants from more diverse backgrounds and experience bases to learn faster together. That's a huge opportunity for companies. If you can catalyze and mobilize these kinds of movements, scalable learning will be a result of all of that. And I think the really interesting thing about this is it's not just for the benefit of the company. If you think about all of these values, leverage, scalable learning, distributed innovation, all of us could benefit from that by participating in that movement. If it's something that really speaks to us, we're going to learn faster as part of that movement than we ever could on our own or as part of just some isolated small group somewhere. We'll get a lot more leverage by connecting with and learning from other people. We'll have a lot of distributed innovation, a lot of things we can watch and learn from. So it's not just for the benefit of the company, it's for the benefit for those of us who are engaged in that particular cause or movement. So I think it's an interesting potential and possibility. I guess what I would suggest is if it is of interest, there are at least 5 questions that I would put on the table for a company interested in this. The first question is, what's your narrative? And by the way, another key issue I run into with executives is when I talk about narratives, is their instinct is to say, if they get interested, they say, oh, let me bring my PR and marketing people in and they'll write me a narrative. No. Narratives emerge from action. They don't emerge from words on a paper. One of the reasons the Think Different narrative of Apple had such power, think about Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. If there were 2 people who in their daily lives epitomized the notion of thinking different, it was those 2 guys. They lived it every day. It wasn't words on paper that a PR group had put together. They were passionately committed to it. So I think finding a narrative that is relevant to your business, to what you're trying to accomplish, that you've already started to at least have some experience with in terms of action, but that by framing it and making it more explicit, potentially could help to draw other people into it. Second question is, where are there people, if you have that kind of narrative, where are the people that narrative would speak to? Where do they come together? Often you find that they come together in communities of interest, online, in various places. But in the communities of interest, you're basically just talking to each other. You're not acting. And what's really interesting is the opportunity to move those people from talk to action by inviting them to join small groups, come together around local action, and then connect with each other as groups so that they can learn faster from each other. So where are those people already congregating, and how can we start to mobilize them into these creation spaces? Third question is, how do we remove or reduce barriers to entry to invite more participation over time? So it's easier for people to join in. We're not creating incredible hurdles for people to just get started in these movements. And what are the tools and resources that we can create to increase the impact from the creation spaces? How can we help enhance connectivity among the groups so that they're learning faster from each other? And then finally, what are some metrics that would allow us to measure the impact of the movement we're trying to create and assess over time, how are we doing? Are we increasing our impact? What are the things that are helping us to have more impact? Let's double down on those. What are the things that are reducing the ability for impact? Let's figure out how we can overcome those. But it's a really key part of developing these feedback and learning loops to have a clear set of metrics that will say, how do I know whether I'm succeeding or not? So I think broad view, I like to say I come from Silicon Valley and I'm inherently an optimist, genetically an optimist. I started with the notion of the dark side of technology and mounting performance pressure. And part of the reason I do that, even though it starts on a downer, is because I think one of the key messages I have for executives is when you start to think about the potential of all this technology that's being deployed, it's not an opportunity. Because when you think about it as an opportunity, it's a choice. Yeah, maybe I could do it today, but I could wait a year or two, maybe 5 years before I really pursue this technology. No, in a world of mounting performance pressure, it is an imperative. It's not an opportunity. If you don't find ways to harness this technology, you're dead. So you got to move now, and you got to move aggressively to turn that pressure into opportunity. And the really good news, at least based on the work we've done, is our belief very much in this big shift as we play this out, is that if we get it right, we have the ability for small moves smartly made to set very big things in motion, to allow us to achieve things that we would have never imagined possible, but that we can now do because of the amplifying effect of these technologies. But in order to do that, I think we need movements. I think we have to focus on narratives and creation spaces to create sustainable movements that will have increasing impact over time. And I think ultimately, as companies, if we want to survive in a world of mounting performance pressure, companies also have to become movements themselves. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm hoping I've provoked a lot of opposition and challenges and questions, and would welcome any and all of those for sure. Yeah, sorry. I think there's a mic here, so.
Hi, my name is June Sung. I'm from FCV Chicago.
Yes.
First of all, I really enjoyed your speech. I think there's a really good analogy there between the two things that you need, the narrative and the creation space. I think a lot of us here who are from a company have a very confident narrative, and it's almost the easier part. But the second part, which is the creation space, I think is a little more difficult because it's human-generated. It's from people. And my question to you is, not only where do you find those people, but how do you identify the right people, and what are some characteristics of the people that will help carry on that narrative for you?
You know, great set of questions. First of all, I would love to have a conversation later about all these companies that have great narratives, because I haven't come into many of them, so would love to hear about them. But in terms of the human element, which I think is absolutely central, the notion of what kind of people do you need? At the end of the day, my belief is it's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the sense that I think the people you need to make movements successful are people who have deep passion, and what I call specifically the passion of the explorer, which is a very specific form of passion. But what's really interesting to me is that narratives actually help to stimulate and catalyze that kind of passion. I'm not one who believes that there are certain people who have passion and most people don't have passion and are not capable of passion. I think we all as human beings have the capability for passion. I think we've been presented with a set of institutions, starting with our educational system, that systematically squeezes out the passion and says your role is to follow orders and be predictable That, I think, has to change, and I think that's one of the key roles for me of a narrative, is by focusing on an opportunity that develops a long-term commitment to something that's really significant, and then creates a willingness to take risk, because the opportunity is so amazing, so powerful. I seek out the challenges. I want to get there as fast as I can. That's another attribute of passionate explorers. And then the third attribute of passionate explorers is this notion of connecting with each other to engage in these challenges. So I'm no longer viewing myself as just an isolated individual who's trying to do something. I'm part of this group that's going after that amazing thing. And together, we can make it happen. And so I think passion gets nurtured, catalyzed and nurtured, if you have an effective narrative, and then provides the fuel for these creation spaces.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you could speak to what happens when narratives grow and you have multiple companies vying for the same audience, each with multiple calls to action and their own narratives. Are we going to be able to attract the same people, or is it just going to strike a chord with the people whose priority lends itself to your company?
Another great question. I'm not sure I have an answer to it. I think that is an issue. I mean, obviously, we've got a whole lot of companies out there, and potential for narratives from every one of them. I do think part of the answer is that there is an opportunity to focus the narrative in particular ways so you can differentiate it from the others. And I think there's also an opportunity over time to have sub-narratives, if you will, within a broader narrative, and that you're at one level coming together around a broader opportunity, but then focusing people on more specific opportunities within that narrative. And so I think there's an opportunity for companies to come together rather than just competing with narratives. It's how can we find companies who have complementary narratives and really create an even broader movement by pursuing them in parallel or together.
Hi there, that was a really great talk. I'm with Edutopia, which is the George Lucas Educational Foundation, and we're trying to do our best to help with this educational narrative and all the stuff that's going on there. My question for you is really about creating these opportunity spaces, and how do you advise somebody who wants to do that but is concerned that maybe the space will start spiraling off into something else, or that it turns against it, or like how do you manage all that short of having a community manager at every single one of these meetings?
Yeah. It's a great question, and from my experience, at least with most institutional leaders, that's one of their big concerns, is this loss of control, if you will. I think the issue is part of the notion of I resist the notion it's loss of control. I think you're giving up the command and control. But I think you have incredible opportunity to shape the actions in the local units around a compelling narrative. I mean, to me, that's one of the key roles of a narrative, is to help align people and make sure people are staying focused on the big opportunity. On the flip side, you know, it's a balancing act, because on the one hand, I think movements that fall into these rigid command and control kinds of, if you form this group, you have to do it all this way or no way or you're out, reduces the potential for distributed innovation, right? So you want a lot of experimentation, improvisation at the local unit level, but you want to try to keep it all kind of generally heading due north, shaped by the narrative. And so.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Annalie from Sydney, Australia. I also want to explore the creative spaces as part of the building of movements. And I'm sort of just wondering, where do you see the movement building to be different to a brand extension platform? I was sort of thinking of examples when you were talking, and thinking of the Dell Women Entrepreneurship Network as potentially an example of creative spaces and movement building by Dell, which is not really in per se in the entrepreneurship building business, but really in distribution of computers. So how would you see that as the difference between brand extension and marketing through thought leadership strategy and movement building and creative spaces?
I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that. I think, as in many things in life, there's a bit of a fuzzy boundary. I think that there are certainly opportunities for companies to speak to and mobilize segments of the stakeholders or population they're trying to reach. To me, the core opportunity around a narrative is getting to the essence of who you are as a company, what you want to accomplish, what kind of impact you want to make on the world, and mobilizing as many people around that as your core narrative. And again, from a marketing point of view, yes, you want to try to find ways to engage more specific segments of the population, but to me, the missing opportunity is that core narrative that says, what am I really trying to accomplish? How can it speak to other people and bring them into the fold? So.
John, what about Facebook and Google? Are they building that narrative? What about YouTube Spaces? What about internet.org? And a second question, which media companies could be doing a better job in that way?
Wow. Again, I don't want to go into comments on specific companies. I would say none of the companies that you've mentioned to me have a narrative. Maybe I'm just missing it, at least the narrative in the way I talk about it. I think they have interesting ways of framing some of their mission, some of their behaviors, the do no evil kind of value to make the information of the world available to the masses. But that's not a narrative. What role am I playing in all of that? And to me, again, the key question of a narrative is what's the call to action for others beyond your company? What are you asking them to do? What's the opportunity that they will achieve by acting? And it's not just buy my product or use my services. It's something bigger. And framing that in a compelling way, I think, again, subject to more deep conversation around specific companies, but I think that's a missed opportunity.
John, thank you for your research and your talk. I work with brands to create and identify ambassadors, and so I just wanted to keep clapping and say, preach, brother, preach when you're up there. I have a very specific question around creation spaces. You said that you observed that typically these groups were 10 to 20 people.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there are any key roles played within that group of the 10 to 20 people, if you guys looked at any other, how you arrived at that number, if that was out of observation or something that you kind of played around with.
I wish I could say it's scientific calculations. It's more through observation of successful creation spaces. And I think the key element, the key driver that makes it difficult to go beyond 10 to 20 people is the need for deep trust-based relationships within the group. And through trust built through action, not just through conversation, but shared action. And that as you start to get larger groups, you tend to fragment, and they may form smaller groups, but 10 to 20 is typically, and you don't want it too small, because part of the value in a group in terms of learning is some diversity in terms of the experiences and perspectives that are being brought to the group. So if it's 2 people, it's not going to be as effective as 10 people. So I think that's one of the key reasons that these small groups. And by the way, I'll just give it a quick example. One of my aha moments as well was an article that Malcolm Gladwell wrote for The New Yorker a number of years ago, which he called the cellular church. And his article was about the evangelical movement. And the key message from the article was, look, the media really misses the point when they talk about evangelicals, because typically they focus on these mass Sunday services where you get 10,000 people coming together in a church to listen to this theatrical presentation by this charismatic preacher. He said, no, the real action in the evangelical movement is they organize into small groups, small cells, 10 to 20 people at the local level. They meet a couple of times a week, not just Sunday. Sunday is to hear the preacher. A couple times a week to talk about what actions can they take in their local environment to have more impact, and to learn from each other as they try to go out and spread the word and get more people into the fold. So that's the cellular church, and again, it's a movement and it's a creation space in the way I would think of it. And so I think that that's another example, again, of 10 to 20 people coming together in these cells. Yeah.
John, the two elements you've described, you can actually absolutely see the way that both of those need to come together for the movement to actually take effect. But in answering even some of the questions, the idea of the narrative or the importance of the narrative is right up there. There's visions in organisations, and so the narrative isn't a vision. It's not something done by marketing and brand. It is something that's therefore led by the CEO, the leadership of that organisation. And you talked about Steve being an individual that was actioning the narrative. It's not about words. That's a lot. How do you make sure you're getting the narrative right? What does it take to explore that narrative? It evolves with this feedback loop at the local action level. I mean, there's a lot in that. Do you have any views or perspectives around how you actually start to define and evolve that narrative?
For $30, I have a book that will tell you exactly how to build a narrative. No, I don't. Unfortunately, I wish I did, but I don't. I think it's the key message that I give to executives. Number one is, before you do anything, make explicit your existing narrative. Because just like I think all of us as individuals have a narrative, even though we've never taken the trouble to articulate it, I think companies have a narrative. Through their actions and the choices they've made, they have demonstrated a narrative that they're acting on. First step is just make that articulate, because most companies, again, I don't think have done that. And then start the questioning around, is this an effective narrative in terms of trying to the impact where we really would like to achieve? And then secondly, rather than spending a whole lot of time crafting the perfect narrative, focus on what are some specific actions we could take in the next 6 months that would make that new narrative or that evolved narrative come alive and become credible. And let's iterate around those actions and refine the narrative that we have emerging in our discussions based on the actions and the results. Are we in fact speaking to and engaging and mobilizing the people we want to mobilize? What kind of impact are we achieving through that mobilization? And just do rapid iteration around it. But it's ultimately emerges through action as opposed to, again, writing it out on a piece of paper. And I think that's ultimately the way to evolve the narrative. Yeah.
Thank you again for your speech. My question's around the creation spaces. Do you have any examples of how companies can facilitate those creation spaces? Do you feel that they're largely self-organizing based on the power of the narrative? And then secondly, on a larger group dynamic, are there any examples of how the communication between those various small groups can be facilitated as well?
Great question. An example that I think is an interesting one that has some attributes, I wouldn't describe it as a perfect creation space, but it's something that SAP, the software company, launched almost 10 years ago, I guess now, the SAP developer community. And initially, the intent was to create this online environment where application developers could come in and ask questions. You know, they were running into a coding issue. Does anybody have any ideas on how I can tackle this particular problem? typically somebody else would start to say, well, I ran into that 3 months ago, here's what I did. It was kind of like the baby center for application developers. But one of the interesting things that SAP did was they developed a reputation profile for each of the participants, where your reputation came not from what you said you were expert at, but from what you had actually solved. What problems have you actually solved? What types of coding issues? Where did you demonstrate expertise through solving problems? That reputation profile had a really interesting effect, and many effects. One of them was just it created some recognition and status for the people who had solved the problems. But it became a magnet to draw these various participants together. I would see that somebody has a reputation profile in an area of expertise that I'd really like to understand more, and I'd start a conversation with that person. Not around a specific problem, but just to get to know the person and really start to build some kind of relationship. And what emerged over time was increasingly a number of application developers started to form really tight-knit relationships with each other and decided, let's go off and write an application together. And they would be from very diverse parts of the world. I mean, this is a global network, and you'd have a team. Is this the signal that the time is over? Oh. So they started to come together in these teams, and SAP, watching this, started to organize collaborative workspaces where these small groups of programmers could come together and start writing software for each other, with each other. And so you had this broad network where they could reach out to ask questions more broadly, but then these tight small groups coming together to develop applications and learn from each other in the process. So interesting kind of evolution, and I think one of the key messages that I have for companies is you don't need to gold plate this creation space from day one with all the features and functions. Start small, start modestly, provide some value to a group, and then help to encourage the groups to come together within the broader platform. So,
thank you.
Sure.
Hi. So
Hi.
It's a similar question. So I'm a startup. We're launching in about June. And we have a narrative. I didn't really think too much about these spaces, although I'm always thinking about how I really want to nurture people. So, obviously resources are scarce. We're a startup. We're trying to build tech features. But do you think it's vital that we should already start renting out a space, or we're in one of these like tech shared office spaces, but making sure that we have a commitment from the get-go to saying, I don't know, once a month or even more than that, of just trying to like speak locally with people, and do you think that's vital, or I just want to hear some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I don't want to say everybody needs to do this from day one. I think it is a more organic process. I think it's being more thoughtful and watchful about where can you start to engage other people, and what kinds of environments would help to those people to have more impact by coming together. And sometimes, again, it could be just an online forum, discussion forum as the starting point. Sometimes it could be local meetups. Sometimes it could be shared workspaces where people come together on a daily basis to work together. It's going to vary depending on the particular set of impacts and activities you're trying to nurture. And again, I think it's evolutionary. I don't think you have to have it all day one. Just be thoughtful about, given the group you already have, what would be most helpful to them in terms of getting more impact and learning faster from each other.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Li and come from China.
Yes.
In our lexicon or language, it's not a lot of difference between movement and revolution. And that makes a lot of people very nervous if we would try to put a movement. So if you can explain to me in simple terms, what's the difference between the two? So if I start a movement in China, I don't get arrested.
Oh, yes. In some parts of the U.S., if you start a movement, you'll get arrested. So I just want to be clear. To be clear, when I talk about movements, I am talking about revolutions. I mean, I'm talking about fundamental change that requires mass participation in order to achieve. To be also clear, I'm not talking about picking up guns and attacking the presidential palace. I'm talking about how can you start to change the hearts and minds of people and get them to act in very different ways that will change everything over time. And so, to be clear, at the end of the day, I am talking about revolution. And I think on that note, it's 6 o'clock, and I don't want to abuse you. Thank you. Thanks very much.